was adopted by 33 votes, 13 against, 10 abstentions.
Why would the UN be so blatantly pro-Zionist? Do not underestimate the power of guilt. Anyone heard of the Holocaust? The UN sought to compensate the Jews over the deaths of 6 million Jews in World War II. Murdered by the Germans. And they decided that the Palestinians should pay for it. Makes perfect sense. However, this amount of land, more than half of Palestine, was still not enough for the Zionists. David Ben-Gurion, the leader of the Zionist movement in Palestine, wrote in 1937, "The Arabs will have to go. But one needs an opportune moment for making it happen, such as a war." The Palestinians had no desire to fight the Zionists or start a war. They were used to living under different sovereigns for hundreds of years: Egyptians, Turks, British, and now the Zionists. In 1948, Ben-Gurion tells the Jewish agency executives, "I believe that the majority of the Palestinian masses accept the partition as fait accompli, and do not believe it is possible to overcome or reject it. The decisive majority of them do not want to fight us." Towards the end of 1947, the Zionist leadership came together and drew Plan Dalet. Plan Dalet was about securing the borders of Israel by cleansing, expelling, and destroying Palestinian towns, villages, and urban neighborhoods. The plan was implemented by the Zionist armed forces.
And finally, in March, they began a push to ensure their control of areas that would become Israel under the partition. And as that happened, you began to get many more Palestinian Arabs fleeing, particularly after a massacre at a place called Deir Yassin, although people now think it was probably somewhat over 100, but not 200. But Begin and the Irgun and the Stern gang, Yitzhak Shamir was part of that. There was a combined attack in this Palestinian village that massacred many people. And the Palestinians did carry out a retaliatory raid, killing about 70 Jewish doctors on the road to Jerusalem shortly thereafter. But after that, you had mobile radio vans the Begin put into play, threatening more Deir Yassins if the Arabs didn't flee. In other words, you'll be massacred just like Deir Yassin. So it became part of the propaganda.
Between the 30th of March and 15th of May, 1948, 200 villages were occupied and their inhabitants expelled. In some villages, such as Deir Yassin and Ain al-Zaytun, horrible massacres were perpetrated. The towns of Tiberias, Haifa, Tzfat, Beisan, Jaffa, and Accra fell into Zionist hands. As a result, more than 250,000 Palestinians were expelled. All of this took place before the 1948 war even started, before one regular Arab soldier set his foot on Palestinian soil.
I became a refugee when I was in a boarding school about 40 kilometers away from my home place. And in April 1948, the headmaster came to us and said, the Jews are attacking people around Tel Aviv, in Jaffa area. They will soon come to our area. I cannot protect you, so you better go home now, quite a bit early, maybe 6 weeks early, before the end of the scholastic year. And I was about 10 at the time, and the distance between the boarding school and my home is about 40 to 60 kilometers, depending on how you do it. And the road to my home was cut off frequently by Zionist soldiers who were riding in jeeps. And the jeeps, I remember clearly, had two machine guns, one pointing forward and the other one pointing backward. And so they would go at terrific speed in the area in which they have no physical presence, except they have garrisons of 30 soldiers in certain locations. They would terrify the farmers, and they would drive on the roads and in the fields, and they shoot anybody in sight. So I have a cousin who was older than me, about 20 years age at that time, and he said, let us walk back home. And he advised us that if you see these jeeps coming, you have to hide in the wheat field, which was then very much in evidence, until you hear the sound of the jeep going away. So we did that, and on the way I had to throw away my bag, my clothes and my books, and we had to walk about 40 kilometers, terrified as a child that one moment we see the jeep and they would kill us. When I arrived home, my mother was so sad, and I think I remember I had to sleep for about 2 days after this ordeal. Now, only 6 weeks later, precisely on the 14th, the night of 14th and 15th of May, our home was attacked again by about 24 tanks, which came to cut Gaza Strip. My home is close to Gaza Strip, but not in Gaza Strip, to cut it into two, to cut it, Gaza Strip into two. And they came, and we have my brothers and cousins, so on. They had some old guns. They held them from about 10 o'clock at night till 6 o'clock next morning. But finally, of course, they could not continue to resist, and the Zionists came and they blew up our homes and burned them. They also blew up the school, which my father built in 1920. It's a primary school, which was our pride, because my father built that school at his expense in 1920 when he had no children. They also blew what's called bayara, which is a well, with motorized well, from which we drink, and also we water our gardens and plantations. Since that time, I spent many days and years, in fact, going through Europe's libraries, especially in London, but also in Paris and in Germany and Istanbul, trying to reconstruct the face of that invisible enemy to me, which destroyed my life ever since, until today. What did we do to them? I never saw a Jew in my life. I never saw, of course, a Zionist soldier in my life. And I had to construct even not only who they were, but the names of the officers who destroyed my life.
It is important to note that during that time, the British had almost 70,000 troops in Palestine. Their mandate, which lasted until the 15th of May, 1948, was to maintain law and order and to protect civilians. They failed miserably in that obligation. While the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians was going on, the Zionists were busy announcing to the world that a second Holocaust was imminent. The Jews were about to be overrun and thrown into the sea. At the same time, in February 1948, Ben-Gurion wrote to his foreign minister, "We will be able not only to defend, but also to take over Palestine as a whole. I am in no doubt of this. We can face all the Arab forces." Confident of their victory, the Zionists declared independence on the 14th of May, 1948. And Ben-Gurion became the first prime minister. On the 15th of May, 1948, 7 Arab countries declared war on Israel and invaded Palestine. In a joint public statement, they explained their reasons. The Zionist aggression in Palestine resulted in the exodus of more than 250,000 of its Arab inhabitants, and in their taking refuge in the neighboring Arab countries. In the beginning of the 1948 war, the Arab forces amounted to approximately 22,000 fighters. The Zionists had 40,000 soldiers. The Jordanians had an army that would have evened the odds. However, King Abdullah decided to sit this one out. Instead, he defended only the bits he wanted to attach to Jordan: Jerusalem and the West Bank.
And one of the myths of this whole period is that you had a little Israel, small Zionists against the Palestinians, and then later on in the war, when the Arab states invaded, that it was David versus Goliath. They were facing overwhelming odds. And this is simply not true, because even then Israel, from May of 48 on, had more troops than the Arab states, who had very small armies. See what I mean? So, but that's one of those things that many people believe. When you had the Arab state invasion, Egypt, Syria, you had Iraqi troops, you had some Saudi, the Lebanese did very little, and you had the Transjordanians. This will become Jordan, which includes the West Bank after 1948. Well, when they invaded, there was no coordination, because no one trusted Abdullah of Transjordan, because he had been dealing with the Zionists in sort of what we might call a non-aggression pact. Although many Israeli historians deny this vociferously, there clearly were discussions and agreements. And although maps show that when you have this attack, you have what we call a Transjordanian attack against Israel, in fact, there was really no attack per se. They were holding on to positions in the West Bank, but where you did have conflict was over Jerusalem. But the Israelis were able, the Zionists, well, they were Israelis after May 14th. When they were confronting the Egyptians, for example, or other people, they really didn't have to worry about their backs in terms of where the Jordanians were, because the Jordanians weren't going to attack them.
While the war was going on, the Zionists increased their ethnic cleansing operations. Villagers were expelled en masse and massacres